Welcome back. The global landscape for climate action is changing. The United States just announced plans to limit CO2 emissions from its fleet of more than 1,600 power plants. China is about to open its 7th regional carbon emission exchange. And Europe, a strong advocate for cutting carbon emissions, has been buying more coal for securing the continent's energy supply. Well, joining me now from London is Damian. He's a senior policy manager at the Climate Group. And from Bonn, Li Shuo, a climate and energy campaigner at Greenpeace in East Asia. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Li Shuo, let me start with you. The Chinese have announced that it will limit total emissions for the first time. How does it plan on doing that?
That's right. I mean, the Chinese is having a very strong intention of capping its CO2 emission. I think the plausible pathways, they will be doing that step by step. So in the next 5-year plan, which will be the 13th 5-year plan stretching from 2016 to 2020, I think there's a likelihood that China will introduce a CO2 absolute control dimension into its existing climate policy toolkit. So I think that, if it is imposed and, the figure on the CO2 number, if we can get that figure very robust, I think it will be a good news for the global effort to combat climate change.
Right, Damian, let's look at Europe. As we've just been saying, Europe wants to cut emissions, but it appears to be under pressure from two sides. On the one hand, because of the accident in Japan, the Fukushima accident, Europe now appears to be backing away from nuclear power. That's the one thing. The other, the recent events in Ukraine, is coming under pressure on supplies from Russia. So does that automatically mean that coal is the answer?
No, not at all. In fact, I think what you're seeing is an environment now that's being created where renewables are stepping into the place of fossil fuels. In terms of nuclear, it's something of a mixed picture. In Germany, yes, the Germans have decided to step away from nuclear, to gradually phase out nuclear in their country. But what they're doing is they're seeking to replace it with renewables, not coal. And we're seeing the benefits of that already.
But you say not coal. The European Union has increased coal imports from the United States, something like 350% over the last decade.
Sure. I mean, what we're seeing playing out here is basically a mix of perverse incentives. But if you look at the top line numbers, if you look at where Europe's heading in terms of its emissions trajectory, the European Union has a 20% reduction target for CO2 emissions by 2020. It's nearly on track to reach that. In fact, the latest figures that came out suggested it was close to 19%, a 19% reduction already compared to 1990. So the EU, is actually well ahead of where it needs to be, and it could actually overachieve those targets. In terms of those coal figures that you've quoted, this is the perverse incentive created by a low carbon price in the EU emissions trading scheme, which is the flagship climate policy for the region. But despite that, as I said before, Europe is on track to actually meeting its targets and hopefully exceeding them by 2020.
Okay, Li Shuo, the plan that we were talking about that China wants to introduce to cut its emissions, one of the glaring omissions, which you've alluded to some extent in your first answer, was the fact that there are no figures in this. Do we know exactly where the Chinese are heading with this?
No, I mean, we don't know yet the figure, but I think, if you look at the context of China's climate and energy governance, they do tend to follow a very pragmatic approach in terms of, laying out their plan step by step. So I think the natural and very important next step is to introduce this CO2 absolute control dimension into the overall climate toolkit. And I think there is also a number of very important domestic developments that can contribute or facilitate, the outcome, which is that we have more robust climate governance. I think one first and foremost element is that as a result of air pollution, we are seeing very robust and rapid change in terms of our coal consumption trajectory. That's the dirtiest fossil fuel that's been fueling China's overall economic growth for the past decades. We are seeing a significant slowdown of coal consumption growth rate. So I think that will definitely contribute to China's further climate action. And I'm very hopeful, in particular, in the next 5 years to see some more progresses.
Right, those domestic concerns that you talk about, there's a great example cited by Bloomberg News, which looked at the city of Taiyuan in Shaanxi province. It's a city that supplies coal mining equipment. Demand is down. Growth in that city has been revised from 12% to something just over 1%. It's sort of 0.01% right now. So it is going to have an effect. I mean, any kind of reform as far as emissions are concerned, as far as climate change is concerned, is going to affect Chinese growth, isn't it? Isn't that a concern for the government?
No, I mean, I think that is a concern, and I think the Shaanxi case, you'll be seeing some of the similar situations in coal-intensive provinces. But I think that is an imperative. That is something that we have to do. I think more and more the Chinese leaders are realizing that the previous heavily coal-dependent pathway is not sustainable. Just to give you a figure, last year in China, 92% of the Chinese cities failed to meet their air pollution standard. So it is a very dramatic and very significant health concern for the Chinese public. So I think we don't have any more choice but to embrace a cleaner energy future. We do have that option on table. China is the largest renewable energy manufacturer, and that do generates you GDP as well as significant jobs. And China is also actually the largest utilizer for renewable energy. In terms of wind, it is the #1 installer in the world. And for solar, we are also getting to the #1 place. So I think those, clean energy options should be more and more adopted, and that will help us gradually phase down our coal consumption and to have a cleaner energy portfolio.
All right, Damian, you mentioned earlier that Europe is looking at renewable sources of energy. What kind of progress is Europe making towards that kind of energy resources or energy sources that Li Shua was just talking about, wind and solar?
Yeah, sure. Well, it varies across across Europe, but there's been some amazing progress, really. If you look at Denmark, for example, last year they generated 1/3 of their electricity from wind power. Now, a few years ago, people said that would be impossible, but even with the current system, they've managed that level of penetration. And as smart technologies come in for controlling the grid, there's an expectation that that level of renewable energy penetration could be much higher. Just in Germany, in the last few weeks, we saw another record level of renewable energy. This was on a quiet day, admittedly, but the country generated 70% of its electricity from renewables, from a combination of wind and solar generation. Germany's really leading the way across Europe. For the last decade or more, it's had what it's called the Energiewende, or energy transition policy. And the aim of that is to basically decarbonize electricity in Germany. And the Germans have basically driven the demand for solar in particular, for solar panels. And that's helped drive the explosion in production within China, which in turn has driven down the price. And that's really the key thing, is the dramatic reductions in renewable energy technology. You mentioned Bloomberg a few years ago, in fact last year. They came out with papers showing that wind energy, for example, is the lowest cost new build source of electricity in a range of countries, including parts of Europe. So, the changes are phenomenal, and you can look at a number of other analysts as well, from Deutsche Bank to Citigroup. They've all come out in recent months, actually, over the last year or so, saying that solar photovoltaics as a source of electricity are going to be the world's #1 source of new electricity, perhaps as early as 2016, 2017, but definitely by the end of 2020.
Right, Damian, where does Europe stand on things like fracking? You know, I know there's been a fair amount of opposition here in the United States because of environmental concerns, the fact that fracking is being used now in the United States, but where does Europe stand on that?
Again, it's a mixed picture, depending on where you are in Europe and the politics involved. If you look at here in the UK, the UK government is particularly keen to open up the estimated reserves for fracking. The UK obviously has a long-term history of gas exploration from the North Sea since the late 1970s. So there is a history of gas exploration in the country.
Right.
But it's a different story, I guess, with fracking because of the fact that it's much more local and it's under people's houses, or at least that's how it's perceived. So there is strong local opposition in some areas. If you look at France, they actually have a moratorium on fracking. If you look at further east, Poland, particularly interested in fracking, obviously driven by changes in the situation in Ukraine, concerns over energy security, dependence on Russian gas, and obviously the political history that Poland has. They are particularly keen, as I said, to exploit their shale gas.
Okay, Lishua, I've just got a little time left, about 30 seconds. I'm wondering if you could tell us, what are the long-term plans in China for energy sources? Does China need to move away from industries that use a lot of coal for its energy?
No, I think it's increasingly getting clear that we definitely need to ramp down our reliance on coal. So I think that it's a really interesting moment back at China. A lot of people are pondering what will be the alternative, but I think the consensus is very clear. This current reliance on coal is not sustainable, and renewable energy is really getting the cost of renewable energy is really getting down. And then we are seeing more and more structural, systematic reform of our power sector that can accommodate more and more renewable energy. So I think that's really a very clear general direction that we are going.
Okay, thank you. Lishua in Bonn, Damian Ryan in London. Thanks to both of you for joining us.